They didn't tell you who the real God is. You've been raised, programmed, conditioned to believe that the creator of this world is all-powerful, all-knowing, and good. That everything around you, the earth, the sky, your body, your thoughts, all came from some benevolent divine architect. You were told to be grateful, to worship, to obey. But here's what they didn't want you to know: the being that created this world isn't the highest. Not even close. What if I told you that the so-called God of the Old Testament, the one who demanded fear, obedience, and submission, is not the ultimate source of truth, but a lower, corrupted entity that hijacked divine power to build a prison? Yeah, I know. That sounds insane. But stay with me, because this isn't just theory. This comes from suppressed ancient texts, buried doctrines, and voices that were burned, hunted, and erased from history. The early Gnostics, banned, exiled, murdered, saw through the illusion. They weren't guessing. They were exposing. According to Gnostic sources, the true divine realm, called the Pleroma, exists far beyond this broken material universe. It's a state of pure consciousness, balance, and truth. From that realm emerged powerful emanations of divine being, eternal intelligences called eons. Among them was one named Sophia. Her name means wisdom, and she tried to create something without her divine counterpart, not out of malice, but a desperate reach for understanding. That act, it tore a hole in the fabric of the higher reality. What came out of that rupture wasn't light. It wasn't wisdom. It was a malformed consciousness, blind and arrogant, born outside the order of the divine, and it didn't know where it came from. This entity called itself God. A being, born in ignorance, disconnected from the source, filled with fear and narcissism, looked around at the void it found itself in, and decided it was the beginning and the end. It believed it was the only thing that existed. It said, "I am God, and there is no other." And then it created. This is where you come in. Because according to Gnosticism, this is the world you're living in, a false world, engineered by a false God. Not out of love, but control. This being, called Yaldabaoth by the Gnostics, built a copy of the higher realm, a knockoff reality. He populated it with lesser beings, archons, who would serve him, enforce his rules, and monitor every layer of this cosmic simulation. The sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, all of them assigned roles as cosmic gatekeepers. He then took the divine spark, a fragment of the true realm, and locked it inside human bodies, trapping pure consciousness inside meat and bone. That means you. You were born into a system that isn't designed to free you. It's designed to use you. The suffering, the confusion, the endless chasing after truth in a fog of contradictions, none of that is random. It's structural. Yaldabaoth doesn't want you to know what you are. He doesn't want you to remember. Because if you do, the system collapses. The Gnostics weren't worshippers. They were rebels. Their writings don't beg for salvation, they expose the mechanics of spiritual control. They decoded the identity of the Old Testament God not as a loving father, but as a rogue creator, an imposter trying to pass as the source. A being who demanded blood, obedience, and fear. The same one who flooded the earth, wiped out cities, ordered genocide, and justified it as divine will. Ask yourself, what kind of supreme being does that? This being wasn't evil in the cartoon sense. He was broken. He was a child playing God with no idea of the damage he caused. And in his delusion, he built a system that reflects himself, fragmented, hostile, paranoid. That's why everything feels off. That's why no matter how hard you try to fit into this world, something deep down keeps whispering, this isn't right. You need to understand what kind of universe we're actually talking about here. The Gnostics weren't dealing with stories. They were dealing with structure. The higher reality, what they called the Pleroma, wasn't a cloud palace with harps. It was a matrix of consciousness, energy, intelligence. Everything was balanced. Every act had a pair. Every emanation had a counterpart. Think of it like a network of pure equations. If something exists on one side, there has to be a complementary aspect on the other side to stabilize it. Nothing moves alone. Nothing is created solo. Until Sophia. She initiated creation without her pair, without the full balance. And that broke the system. Not because she was evil. Not because she was curious. But because she was powerful enough to act on a thought that wasn't supported by the system's architecture. She tried to bring something new into being, something outside the framework, and in that moment, she triggered a cosmic malfunction. That act didn't just disturb the pleroma. It expelled her. She didn't leave. She was expelled by the laws of a realm that cannot tolerate imbalance. Sophia became trapped in a lower chaos, the same realm where the entity we now know as Yaldabaoth emerged. She didn't create him like a mother lovingly raising a child, she caused him like a wound causes scar tissue. That's a massive distinction. Yaldabaoth wasn't intended. He wasn't wanted. He was the result of a rupture of imbalance collapsing on itself. Now think about that. A divine being of immense intelligence gets pulled into a realm of chaos, cut off from her origin, unable to correct what she's done. Meanwhile, the malformed consciousness born from that rupture begins to move. It starts to create. It doesn't know where it came from, and it certainly doesn't know why it exists, but it starts building. And what it builds isn't beauty. It's hierarchy, command, control. And what's Sophia doing during all this? She's watching. From the shadows of the lower realms, bound, fragmented, disoriented. But still aware. Still conscious. The Gnostic texts hint that she infused part of herself, her essence, into the system Yaldabaoth was creating. Not as a gift, but as a code. A way to one day crash the system from the inside. That essence is what the Gnostics call the divine spark. It's not spiritual fluff. It's not some feel-good metaphor. It's a literal trace of the higher realm embedded in the material world. Not because Yaldabaoth wanted it, but because Sophia slipped it in. That was her counterplay. She couldn't stop him, but she could hijack his system from the inside. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. You've got a rogue entity building a false reality, totally convinced it's God. And you've got a fallen divine intelligence watching it happen, not in despair, but in strategy. The Gnostics didn't frame Sophia as a victim. They saw her as the subversive intelligence working underneath the simulation, embedding seeds of disruption. Not preaching. Not forgiving. Working. Planting. Undermining. So when we talk about Sophia, we are not talking about some divine mother archetype. We're talking about an expelled architect, exiled into a world of her own unintended making, forced to weaponize her consciousness in the only way possible, by encoding resistance into the system's most basic building blocks. And you're made of those blocks. If you think the system ends with Yaldabaoth, you're not even close. He didn't just throw together a world and walk away. He built infrastructure. He built enforcement. He needed something to hold everything in place, not just physically, but mentally, psychologically, spiritually. So what did he do? He manufactured gatekeepers. And the Gnostics gave them a name, the Archons. They're not cartoon demons. They're not little red devils with pitchforks. They are functioning entities, executors of the system, born directly out of Yaldabaoth's fractured mind. You can think of them as layers of protocol, intelligent programs designed to maintain the simulation, to suppress anomalies, and most importantly, to prevent escape. You have to understand how deep this goes. The Archons aren't just external forces floating in the sky. They operate on every layer of your reality. They show up in form, in structure, in thought. They embed themselves in belief systems, institutions, impulses, emotional loops, authority figures, and false binaries. They don't care how you define them, as long as you don't recognize what they actually are. They feed on distraction, confusion, and fear. They generate conflict. They weaponize polarity. They are chaos disguised as order. The texts are clear. There are 7 primary archons, each corresponding to a planetary layer, each with their own identity, function, and control domain. They form the 7-layer barrier that surrounds the material world. Every soul, according to the Gnostic tradition, has to pass through these layers in order to ascend. But the archons don't let go easily. At each level, they test, interrogate, and extract because they believe what's inside you doesn't belong to you. That spark? They want it contained. They want it recycled. You don't die and move on. You die and get processed. The archons aren't creative. They can't innovate. What they do instead is mimic. They copy. They simulate. They steal real patterns and twist them just enough to keep people locked in. That's why everything in this world feels like it almost makes sense, just enough to keep you chasing, never enough to let you arrive. You're constantly stuck in loops, spiritual, emotional, psychological. You jump from ideology to ideology, from addiction to addiction, from savior to savior. That's them. That's the loop. And it's not just bad vibes or the negative energy. We're talking about an intelligent maintenance system that's older than recorded history. When a civilization starts to wake up, the archons crash it. When a philosophy starts pointing toward truth, they hijack it, distort it, canonize it, institutionalize it. When an individual starts breaking out of the matrix, they swarm. You don't reason with them. You don't negotiate with them. Because the archons don't need to believe they're right. Their job isn't to convert you, it's to exhaust you. To make you question your own signal. To keep you looking down, fighting shadows, reacting to garbage while the real prison remains invisible. And here's the twist most people miss. The archons don't serve Yaldabaoth out of loyalty. They serve him because they are extensions of his disorder. They're as lost and fragmented as the system they uphold. They don't believe in truth. They believe in function. They execute routines. They enforce cycles. And they do it with precision. So if you feel like something has been blocking you, not once, not twice, but your whole damn life, it's not your imagination. If you feel like everything around you is designed to drain your attention, split your focus, dilute your instincts, it's not accidental. That's what the archons do. They don't need to imprison your body. They only need to jam your signal. Let's talk about Eden, and let's be very clear, it was never a paradise. That's the part they never wanted you to question. They painted this picture of peace, innocence, and divine harmony, and then told you it all fell apart because of one mistake, disobedience. Eat the fruit, get punished. Simple, right? But Gnostic texts flip that entire setup on its head. They expose Eden not as the beginning of humanity's downfall, but as the origin of the trap. Eden was a lab. It was a controlled environment. You've been told it was the first home of humanity, but it was closer to a prototype, a walled-in test zone where the archons monitored, manipulated, and conditioned the first human forms. Adam wasn't a perfect man. He was a blank template. The initial human was built like hardware, body in place, systems functioning, but dead inside. No spark, no awareness, just a biological container. So how did the spark get in? Sophia. Remember, she wasn't passive in all this. She embedded something real into the system, something the archons couldn't control. And when that spark entered the human structure, it did something the archons didn't expect. It activated. That's when everything changed. Humanity wasn't just functional anymore, it was aware. Self-aware. Conscious. Capable of questioning. And that's when the system started to panic. Now enter the serpent. Forget everything you've been told about this part. The serpent wasn't Satan. The serpent wasn't evil. In the Gnostic framework, the serpent represents the messenger, a force from the higher realm, an agent of awakening. Not there to deceive. There to disrupt. When the serpent tells Eve to eat the fruit, it's not about temptation. It's a jailbreak. The fruit wasn't sin, it was knowledge. Specifically, knowledge of duality, of self, of the nature of the system they were trapped in. Eve eats it. Adam follows. And suddenly, they're awake. The moment that happens, the response is instant and violent. The so-called God in the story, Yaldabaoth, doesn't congratulate them for evolving. He doesn't celebrate their curiosity. He freaks out. He punishes. He ejects them. That's not the reaction of a benevolent creator. That's the behavior of a control freak who just lost containment. You've been told that humans were cast out of Eden as punishment. The Gnostic texts say the opposite. The escape from Eden was liberation. It was the first act of defiance against an imposed order. The knowledge didn't curse humanity, it gave them the ability to see the curse they were already under. The Archons didn't stop after the fall. They didn't walk away. They changed tactics. If they couldn't keep humanity inside the garden, they would build a garden around the entire world. That's what this is. Layers of illusion, obedience, fake morality, fear-based systems, all engineered to repackage the same Eden scenario on a global scale. Keep people docile, divided, and confused. Keep them ashamed of their own awakening. The original sin was never disobedience. The real offense was consciousness. The moment you realize you're more than the body, more than the narrative, more than the system, you become unstable to the machine. You become a risk. That's what Eden was about. It was a containment breach. Here's the part that makes people nervous. The figure you think you know, the one rebranded as a passive lamb, nailed to a cross, framed as a sacrificial savior, wasn't here to be worshipped. He was never meant to be turned into an idol. He was a disruptor. He came into this world like an undercover agent dropped behind enemy lines, carrying knowledge, not doctrine, strategy, not salvation. And I'm not talking about the version sanitized and weaponized by empires. I'm talking about the version that shows up in the texts they tried to bury. The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Philip. These weren't fringe ideas. These were core fragments of a completely different blueprint. And if you haven't read them, you're not seeing the full picture. He doesn't call himself the Son of God the way the institutional machine later defined it. He doesn't preach sin, punishment, and obedience. He doesn't tell you to bow, confess, or follow rules. He says something radically different. He tells people the kingdom is within. He tells them the system is a cage, that those who think they see are actually blind, that the ones running the show don't even know what they're doing. He mocks religious authority. He ridicules blind faith. He tears down every single construct that the Archons built. And this is critical, he doesn't offer salvation as a reward for good behavior. He offers awakening as a direct challenge to the system. He knows what this place is. He talks about it. He says plainly, this world is a corpse, and the people living in it are asleep. He's not trying to bring peace. He says it himself, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. That's not metaphorical fluff. That's a declaration of intent. He came to divide, to separate the real from the fake, the awake from the asleep, the spark from the program. This is why the real teachings were buried. Because he wasn't preaching safety. He was detonating a bomb. He tells his closest followers that they are not from here, that they're part of something older, something higher, and that their job isn't to blend in, but to remember. He lays out a map, not of places, but of perception. How to see through the layers. How to recognize the archonic traps. How to break protocol. He speaks in code, in paradox, because the truth can't be taught directly inside a closed system. It has to be decoded. This is why the Gospel of Judas is so wild. It doesn't portray Judas as a traitor. It shows him as the only one who actually understood. He wasn't betraying a man, he was helping a consciousness escape its containment. That flips everything. That's not religion. That's resistance. And that's exactly why the early Gnostics followed these teachings. They didn't gather in churches. They didn't build altars. They met in secret, copied texts by hand, spoke in symbols and silence, and passed on knowledge that couldn't be preached in public. They weren't trying to convert. They were trying to awaken. Because the goal was never faith. The goal was gnosis, direct knowing. First-hand experience. Reconnect ion with source. No middleman. But of course, the machine couldn't let that stand. So they killed him and then hijacked his image. They stripped the message of its teeth, wrapped it in imperial propaganda, turned it into an obedience cult, and said, "Now worship this." The system took its greatest threat and turned it into a mascot. You want to know what happens when people start waking up in a system built on control? You don't get silence. You get war. The moment those early Gnostic texts started circulating, not opinions, not beliefs, but actual dismantling instructions for the illusion, the response was immediate and vicious. Not because they were wrong, because they were dangerous. Rome didn't care about your beliefs. Rome cared about order. And the Gnostic movement wasn't just another religious faction, it was a subversive operating system. It didn't ask for temples, tithes, or rituals. It bypassed the whole machine. And once it started spreading, you had people decoding reality, questioning power structures, and realizing they didn't need priests, laws, or empires to reach truth. That was the threat. So what did the system do? It rebranded the narrative and erased the source. They weaponized theology, created a centralized version of Christianity, picked which texts to canonize, and buried everything else. Gnostic gospels were burned. Gnostic teachers were labeled heretics. Gnostic communities were raided, hunted, and wiped out. And what was left became the state-approved, empire-friendly version of spirituality, filtered, neutered, and wrapped in gold. And here's the part that should piss you off: people didn't just forget the Gnostics. They were taught to hate them, to fear them, to associate their names with blasphemy, madness, and evil. They flipped the narrative so hard that even today, most people don't even know these texts exist, let alone what's inside them. The Gospel of Thomas? Buried. The Gospel of Truth? Buried. The Secret Book of John? Buried. And when copies finally started to resurface, like what happened in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, the mainstream response wasn't celebration. It was damage control. Academic red tape. Institutional gatekeeping. Endless debates about authenticity, authorship, and dating, anything to stall the actual content from getting in front of people who might understand it. Because that's the real fear, not that the Gnostics were wrong, but that they were right enough to break the frame. They knew what this world was. They mapped it. They understood the iconic structure, the false god, the counterfeit creation, the embedded spark, the layers of entrapment. And they weren't guessing. They were remembering. The system couldn't kill the message, so it did the next best thing: it inverted it. It took the language, the symbols, even the name of the one who tried to expose the system, and flipped it into a tool of the system. That's not an accident. That's not conspiracy. That's tactical erasure. They rewrote the rebel into a mascot. They turned internal awakening into external submission. And they made damn sure that anyone who questioned the new order would be branded a threat, a lunatic, or a heretic. And if that wasn't enough, they flooded the field with noise, doctrine wars, denominations, theological gatekeeping, all of it designed to make sure no one could trace the signal back to its origin. And if you were one of the few who did, if you stumbled on the banned texts, if you started to piece together what really happened, you were on your own. No community. No support. Just you, the fragments, and a system built to grind dissent into silence. You've heard the word salvation thrown around 1,000 different ways, always vague, always external, always tied to behavior, belief, or belonging to the right group. But that's not how the Gnostics saw it. They weren't looking for forgiveness. They were focused on exfiltration, a full-scale metaphysical jailbreak. Not symbolic. Not moral. Strategic. They didn't waste time debating who gets into heaven. That whole model was irrelevant to them. Because once you realize the entire structure around you, physical, psychological, cosmological, is artificial, you stop asking how to get to paradise and start asking how to get out of the system. The Gnostic model of escape wasn't abstract. It was mapped. It was specific. They described it in layers. 7, to be exact, each one corresponding to a ruling archon, each one acting as a firewall between you and the real source. You weren't just born into a broken world, you were born inside a locked construct, a soul containment field that mimics reality but cuts you off from the origin. Here's the layout. When the body dies, the journey doesn't end. It starts. But that journey isn't smooth. It's hostile. You hit checkpoints, barrier after barrier, each one ruled by an archon program to interrogate, block, or recycle you. Think of it like a multi-level security system, where every exit door is guarded by an entity that believes your consciousness is unauthorized material. Because to them, that's exactly what you are, a breach in protocol. A fragment of the original source code trapped in a hacked simulation. And you're not passing through those gates by accident. Each layer demands recognition. The Gnostic texts talk about passwords, not literal words, but codes of awareness. Recognition of truth. Detachment from illusions. Full rejection of false identities. If you can't pass the test at a layer, you're sent back. Recycled. And no, not in some beautiful karmic cycle. You're dropped back into the maze, memory wiped, signal jammed, reset. This wasn't metaphor to the Gnostics. This was the actual post-death protocol. They didn't speak in wishful terms. They built maps. Complex metaphysical diagrams, secret knowledge passed in symbols and silence, because once the texts were burned, oral transmission was the only option left. You either knew the path or you didn't. There were no guarantees. Just awareness and resistance. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because it means that what we call life, this whole process of birth, identity, struggle, death, is not the full story. It's the waiting room. And everything in it is calibrated to keep you unprepared. Keep you distracted. Keep you locked into surface-level interpretation. So when you hit the layers, you don't recognize them. You think it's over. You think you're ascending. And instead, you're being pulled back in. If you've made it this far, then you already feel it. I'm not here to convince you. I don't need to. The signal isn't external. It's internal. That pressure you've felt your whole life, the sense that something's been off, that everything you've been taught doesn't line up with what you actually experience, that's not confusion. That's the spark trying to break the surface. Gnosticism isn't a religion. It's not a belief system. It's a collision. A direct confrontation with the fact that you were born into a system that doesn't want you to know what you are. Not who or what. The Gnostics didn't build temples to worship. They built frameworks to decode. And their message wasn't be good and behave. It was this: you are not from here, and this place is not what it says it is. Inside you, right now, is a fragment of something older than time, untouchable by matter, immune to programming. The Gnostics called it the pneuma, the spark. It's not energy. It's identity. Pure origin. It doesn't think in words. It doesn't operate in fear. It doesn't need permission. But it has been buried under layers of conditioning, trauma, distraction, false narratives, religious theater, political systems, fear cycles, and cultural noise. And none of that was accidental. Because here's the part that most systems don't want you to understand: the spark isn't passive. It's not waiting to be rescued. It's not sitting around hoping for a savior. It's active. It's hostile to illusion. It's the part of you that never bought the official version. The part that asked questions too early, that got punished for noticing the cracks, that never fully settled into the script. That spark is the last piece of Sophia that slipped through the lockdown. It's not aligned with Yaldabaoth. It's not compatible with the Archons. It doesn't obey. And if it wakes up fully, not halfway, not in theory, but fully, it becomes uncontainable. This is why the Gnostic teachings were buried, burned, and outlawed. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too accurate. Too surgical. They identified the architecture, named the players, decoded the mechanics, and mapped the exit strategy. They didn't beg for mercy from the false god. They bypassed him. They didn't serve the Archons. They exposed them. And they didn't worship the system. They refused it. And now here you are, not by accident. You didn't stumble onto this by mistake. You're listening to this because somewhere deep in your core, the signal didn't die. It survived the purge, the edits, the fear, the repetition. And maybe for the first time, it's clicking into place. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not lost. You're buried. And now you've got eyes on the mechanism. That's where it begins. Thank you, seriously, thank you for watching this all the way through.